Thank you, Baruch, for having me, and thank you to everyone for getting up and attending this morning. The conference has been really wonderful, and I've learned a lot already. Yesterday, we heard a lot about the use of McLuhan and perhaps more broadly cybernetics in design of kind of objects and local systems. Today I'm going to talk about design's kind of grandest ambitions, that is, the design of an entire economy, of an entire society. And I'm going to talk about the kind of long-standing socialist dream of a kind of planned economy. It's pretty common today to hear people say that planning, central planning in particular, is possible today in ways that it wasn't in 1930 or 1917, precisely because we now have microprocessors that can handle vast amounts of data in microseconds and can perform calculations that were impossible 15 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago. So this has become a quite common idea, right? People will say, well, you know, central planning was impossible for the USSR because they didn't have computers. And today we have computers that can plan an economy, and we no longer need to be dependent upon the market in order to kind of organize society. We can organize it directly using information technology. I want to kind of critique this idea. I want to investigate it, and I want to show why it really misunderstands what the problem with socialist central planning was. So that's mostly what I'm going to do today. It's going to be at times somewhat technical, and eventually I'm going to make my way to discussing art and art's relevance to this process by looking at the film work of Melanie Gilligan, a friend of mine who's done really wonderful work kind of exploring the contemporary technological moment, and I think pointing out some of the pitfalls of the kind of thinking that we're going to look at today. And so I'm going to try to go back and forth between talking and reading. This is somewhat new work, so I feel less able to kind of talk extemporaneously on it, and there's a part of me that really wants to just read because I feel safer reading from a text than talking about something I'm still trying to figure out. To link planning and computing is, of course, almost a tautology. A stored program is, for example, nothing if not a series of plans, and the first task to which computers were devoted involved the distribution of resources by non-market means in large corporations and other centrally planned institutions such as the military. Indeed, the very field of cybernetics that enveloped early computing experiments took planning as one of its most important potential applications, as demonstrated by cybernetician Stafford Beer's Chilean adventures with CyberSyn, the prototype for socialist planning by computer. This history is perhaps obscured by the fact that computing has developed as an adjunct to capitalist production in an age in which more and more aspects of social life are being turned over to the coordination of the market, an entity supposed by Marxists and many others beside to be the opposite of planning, despite the fact that market-dependent corporations do, in fact, plan for and with markets and take great interest in the use of computing for such purposes. The concept of planning is central to the development of socialism and communism, traceable back to the utopias Fourier, Saint-Simon, Cavell, and others. For Marx and his followers, planning represented an alternative to the coordination of human activity by markets and, in turn, by capitalist value, but also an alternative to the personalized domination of pre-capitalist social relations. In Marx's rich account, planning in and as communism renders social activity not only transparent, overcoming the mystifications of commodity fetishism, but tractable as well, doing away with the wasteful distribution of resources according to the law of value and allowing everyone control over the processes that affect them. So here's the kind of first distinction that I want to open with, right, which is that planning is about knowledge, it's about making things visible to people, it's about transparency, but it's also about control. And I think you can see that in this Marx quote right here, right? He says, "The veil is not removed from the countenance of the social life process, i.e. the process of material production, until it becomes production by freely associated men and stands under their conscious and planned control." So, you know, if you know Marx, you know that he has this account which says that in capitalist society, we don't understand the way that the world works because these social processes are kind of mystified by their operation. There's a kind of commodity fetishism that makes us think that objects are kind of doing things and obscures the fact that there are kind of social relations underneath those objects. We talked a little bit about this in terms of McLuhan. So that's a question of knowledge and transparency, but that's directly connected to the ability to control things, right? So I think that what I want to point out is that, you know, for Marx, that planning is not just about knowledge, it's not just about calculation and measurement, it's also about control. And that's something that really falls out of the debate when later people talk about socialist planning. They make it all about a question of what is calculable, what is measurable, and they kind of ignore the question of how you're going to manage things. And so, so what we have is, you know, this kind of opposition between transparency on the one side and control on the other, and most of the socialist calculation debate, you know, turns into a question about transparency entirely. So just to kind of rehearse this history, in the early part of the 20th century, pro-capitalist economists like Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek, they kind of raised a challenge to socialists who had found in neoclassical economic theory a kind of hope that you could plan an economy. If you know anything about microeconomics and you know anything about neoclassical economics, the central metaphor for how Marxist works is that there's a markets work is that there, you know, in Walras' account, there's this kind of imaginary auctioneer, right, who listens to all the possible offering prices and then matches those offering prices with goods on the market. So there's this idea of a kind of auctioneer in the center of a market that's kind of coordinating all this activity. So socialists thought, well, okay, if there's an auctioneer in a market, maybe we can just, you know, actually make the planning board into the auctioneer. And people like Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek wanted to challenge that idea. And Hayek's challenge is really ingenious, and I think a really important thing to look at. He's probably my favorite right-wing thinker of the 20th century. And he has a really great essay called The Use of Information by Society. And his point is basically this. He doesn't focus on the calculability of value, that's to say, calculating the relative prices of goods directly, you know, with formulas and equations, which is what money does imperfectly by establishing a kind of similar price. Really what he focuses on is the question of kind of knowledge and measurement of the location of objects and goods. For Hayek, money was this kind of telecommunication instrument. It was a media in the way that McLuhan understands it. It communicated what he talks about as the price signal, right? And what it did is it measured the kind of relative values of goods, and it communicated only what you needed to know to everybody else. And in that way, it kind of aggregated information that no single person could possess. And he gives the example of sort of say, the market for tin, right? Somewhere, somebody figures out a new way to use tin in an industrial process, and all of a sudden, there is, you know, excess demand and too little supply of tin, and the price goes up People don't need to know that this new use of tin has been discovered. All they need to know is that it's happening. They don't need to know what it is. They don't need to know anything about it. All they need to know is that it's happening, and then immediately they begin to kind of economize on tin, use less of it, or they switch to some other kind of technique that doesn't use tin, uses another metal that's cheaper. And so it's a sort of money as an index that allows everybody to know what they need to know and to know what can't be known by any single person, right? And so it kind of coordinates in this, and he's almost a mystic, right? Hayek didn't really actually believe in the use of mathematics for economics. He thought that a lot of it was sort of nonsense, and he was not really a big fan of marginalism, which is highly mathematical in its treatment of these things. And he thought there was this kind of mystical, almost systematic calculation that money did. And that just couldn't be replaced by a market, because there was something that the man on the scene, had this kind of local knowledge of how things worked and how to kind of get productivity out of systems that couldn't be aggregated. That's to say, and everybody knows this in work. There's people who know things that are they're sort of tacit and intuitive, and that are really hard to kind of codify in rule books, right? It's like, if anybody's ever worked in an office environment or environment, there's just people who kind of know things, and once they're gone, things become really inefficient, and it's really hard to aggregate all of that information. So, that's basically Hayek's argument against, central planning. But what I want to say is that he sort of misses really a key point. And he makes the whole thing into a question of kind of epistemology, or we might say calculation. Some other people focus more on calculation. Hayek focuses more on epistemology. He makes it into a kind of technical question about knowledge over kind of technique. But what this really ignores is this whole other set of questions about how resources and people are transferred back and forth in an economy, how people are managed, and those are political questions. So, to really understand this, I think it might be helpful to look at the kind of cybernetic model that Hayek was implicitly working with, right? Which is that an economy works through processes of feedback, right? And through this is able to kind of distribute information and regulate itself. And his focus on the question of measurement, knowing where things are, knowing how many of those things there are, and how to do things is really important. So is the focus on kind of, the calculation that happens. But what he doesn't really talk a lot about is how things are kind of redistributed. So if any of you guys know anything about cybernetics, to have a cybernetic system, you really just need three things. You really just need three things. You need a sensor. You need some kind of way to measure the world and take input in from the world. You need some kind of processor, right, which can aggregate that information and compare it and then know what to do with it that's programmed in some way. And then you need some form of output. We call it an effector. And that effector then acts on the world, acts on the sources of those inputs, and then receives new inputs. Right? And in that way, you can have a system that is sort of acting on itself, that's self-regulating in response to its environment. And this is very much the way that Hayek conceives of an economy, right? You have essentially the money instrument kind of measuring demand for goods and measuring the amount of goods that are out there, and then because there's a kind of single price and there's a competitive mechanism and people are adjusting their prices, any person knows to be able to kind of compare those prices with their costs and aggregates all of that information. Some money allows for this calculation to happen. But then in a further step, there is a kind of redistribution of resources that happens because of the profit motive, right? So capitalists, suddenly realize that the price of tin has gone up and they can't produce this thing that they were making cheaply enough to make profit. So they either figure out a way to use less tin, or they use something else, or they get out of that line altogether and go and produce something else. And so in response to these signals from the market that the money is giving them, you get a kind of redistribution of resources from one line of production to another, and money eventually flows into the lines that have the most highest productivity, the lines that are the kind of using resources most efficiently, and the lines where there's actually demand for the goods. And in this way, capitalism kind of regulates itself and achieves this kind of constant increase in productivity. The really important part of this is not just measurement, not just knowing where things are, not just knowing what people want, and not just calculating, right? You may be able to do all of those things, but the really important part is being able to move things around from one site to another, and that means moving people around. And this is what the people miss. It means, actually being able to shift workers from one line of production to another, right? And capitalism has a way of doing this that's quite brutal. And shifting resources from one area to another. And I would argue that the real problem that existed with actually existing socialism was not really a problem of measurement or a problem of calculation. They did have problems of measurement and problems of calculation, right? In the USSR, they didn't really know how many 3-inch bolts they had in the economy. That information was not available. And the mathematical techniques in order to compute the relative prices of all the things weren't really existing. They didn't have the computing technology. But the real problem was that the USSR and China and every other country that's tried central planning had no control over labor, and they had no control over the resources and no way of getting the people who were responsible for coordinating resources to actually move it around in the ways that they want. And this may be actually surprising. We kind of think of the USSR as this totalitarian system that had complete control over labor, but actually the opposite is true. They had no control over labor. They had no way of getting people to work in a way that they actually didn't just produce junk. And they had no way of increasing productivity. And the reason why, it's actually quite simple and quite easy to understand once you explain it, is that in a socialist economy, or a nominally socialist economy, you can't really fire people, right? Because people are essentially, you have to give them a job. You say, if you want to eat, you have to work, right? Okay, but then that means you have to provide work for everybody. It's not like capitalism where you can just turn them out and leave them dependent upon other people. So people could be dismissed from one line of production. They're working really bad in the bolt factory, but then the kind of central planning board has to give them a job somewhere else, right? So there was no real way to get rid of workers. So in fact, in the USSR, they had very little control over labor. Have very little ability to kind of raise productivity and very little ability to control the quality of goods. And so what happened is they produced massive amounts of coal and steel and all these kind of raw inputs, which are very easy to produce and don't require a lot of quality. But they couldn't make any consumer goods because that actually requires precision. It requires efficiency, and the system was very, very broken. And they had no way of kind of moving people around where they were needed. So really, it was a question of control over labor, and the way that it ended up working out was that they just tried to use as much violence as possible to raise productivity, and that was somewhat effective. But it was a kind of partial solution to this real problem, the tractability of labor, because people weren't invested in the system. They didn't have any reason to be because it wasn't providing anything for them. And so managers would kind of use incentives and violent sanction in order to get workers to produce better. So today, we have a kind of an argument, just to return to the idea of cybernetic socialism. Today you hear people say, okay, well, they couldn't really plan an economy in the early part of the 20th century, but now we can, right? We have, not only do we have these computers that can process vast amounts of information, but we have a kind of distributed computing that is everywhere in the world, and we can put these little chips inside of everything, you know? They're all over this room, they're all over everywhere. We have this thing called the Internet of Things, right, where every object will have a little computer inside of it. And we can use that to kind of monitor in real time, you know, how many 3-inch bolts there are and how well people are working and all of this stuff, right? We can get all of this constant real-time information about what people are doing and how they're doing it and where they're doing it, and we're gonna know exactly where everything is. And then we're gonna be able to aggregate all that information and kind of pull it together, and then, you know, we can use that information to then coordinate production. And this is, you hear this, it's a pretty common idea. So sometimes it gets called, you know, Gosplan 2.0. Gosplan was the central planning board in the USSR, or Google Gosplan. The idea is that these platforms like Google, you know, or maybe Amazon, are already kind of doing this. They already possess this information. They're already kind of aggregating this distributed computing power and developing systems to kind of track the location of goods and the productivity of workers. And there's some truth to this. The logistics industry is really based on this, is trying to kind of track in real time, you know, how much stuff is moving out of the warehouses and out of the retail stores, and being able to adjust kind of supply instantaneously in order to kind of minimize the amount of time that goods are just sitting around waiting to be delivered to the consumer or to the next stop on their travels. So you get people like Isabella Kaminsky writing for the Financial Times, you know, which is the only good English language newspaper in the world. And she's sort of a Hayekian, right? She thinks this is bad. And why she thinks this is bad is that she thinks these platforms are kind of hoarding information that they could share, and that what they're doing is they're distorting the price signal, and that companies like Amazon and Google are selling goods for cheaper than they're actually worth in order to gain information about consumers' behaviors, and then they sell that information. But what that does is it makes it really, really hard for anybody to know how much things really cost. So for her, Google Gosplan is like a return to the inefficiencies of the Soviet system, right? It's distorting what the market does really well, which is distribute information about how much stuff really costs. We know that Amazon, for instance, you know, sells things below their cost often, right? Because it's really oriented toward just, you know, capturing more of the market and making more and more money. So, you know, for her, it's a bad thing. You know, Evgeny Morozov or Eugene Morozov in The Guardian kind of takes her idea and says, yeah, it's true. And, you know, they are doing this, but what if they actually made that information public? Then we would be able to kind of use it to benefit people. You know, and he says, the problem with Google is not that it thinks that it is a better computer than the market, and Friedrich Hayek, the chief theorist of neoliberalism, thought that the market was just that, a computer that could process and incorporate all the price signals to arrive at an optimal price, and that no better computer was available to central planners, but that all its optimization efforts aim to satisfy just one goal, profit maximization. And so he's kind of implicitly saying that what if we took over these companies and we had a different optimum, you know, we had a different kind of goal, that we were trying to optimize other things rather than profit, some idea of human welfare, maybe output in general, that would be great. And you hear these people, you hear this idea a lot that, you know, we should kind of nationalize Google and Amazon and use them, you know, as utilities or as a kind of way to build socialism. This is also very much made explicit in Benjamin Bratton's new book where he talks about Google Gauss plan, and he says, "We are interested in systems that can adjudicate the socialist pricing problem, knowing that centralized systems can be too slow to sense and calculate individual price signals, and as well as the capitalist pricing problem, that market models can confuse the emergent effects of transaction liquidity with systems planning, and do so at the expense of artificially segregating and suppressing the real costs of near and long-term externalities." And kind of here's the gist. He says, we allow to the pronounced consternation of both socialist and capitalist realists that some polypaternal supercomputational descendant of Google Gauss plan might provide a mechanism of projection, response, optimization, automation, not to mention valuation and accounting, beholden neither to market idiocracy nor the dim bureaucratic inertia, but to the appetite and expression of a curated algorithmic phyla and its motivated users. So he's basically saying the same thing, with a lot of words, but again, he makes it into a question of measurement. For him, he puts Google Gauss plan under, he has very idiosyncratic ways of cataloging all of these things, but he puts it under the question of address, right? The addressability, right? And address means, having a kind of location and a cataloging or indexing system for every kind of item, right? And what's great about Google is it can address everything, right? It knows where everything is. It can measure and locate every single thing. And he says the calculation problem for centralized plans or decentralized markets or any combination of these depends on the availability of data, which itself depends not only on the worldly divulgence and figuration of information from signal to sensor, but on how any platform apparatus is constructed to construe the world as an addressable surface in the first place, right? So it's just about knowing where things are, right? And he has this idea of kind of deep address, like that the computers can locate things in a way that we can't with our eyes see, right? They have this way of kind of locating down at this very deep level or at this very big level that's beyond human perception. But again, what I've been saying is that misses the point. It makes everything into a problem of transparency, into an epistemological problem, and completely ignores the question of control. When you're talking about optimization, you're talking about choosing from one way of organizing the world and going to another way of organizing the world. And that means you have to move things and people around. And that question is not addressed at all. So basically, there are a number of ways to think about the calculation problem. The first way is just, and this is where it gets a little bit technical, and maybe I could just whip through this really quickly. Sometimes when people talk about calculating, it's just this mathematical problem, right? We have an economy and we have 10 million different items, right? There's so many different things, right? Every brand has to be a different thing, right? And so we have this economy. Let's say there's 10 million commodities. That's actually an existing estimate. That's a lot. Okay? If we want to do what the market does and give a price for everything in terms of any other thing, let's say we're going to calculate it all in terms of barrels of oil or in terms of labor. Labor is the thing that socialists like to use. We need to come up with a gigantic matrix that's 10 million long on one side and 10 million long on the other side. And that matrix is going to tell you how many barrels of oil you need to make your 3-inch bolt and how many 3-inch bolts you need to make your car. Right? And it's going to have the relationships between any unit of one good and any unit of another good. And if you have that matrix and you can manipulate it and put it in an equation, then you can you can do what the market does without having to have money. And that's a hard problem, right? People estimate that there are credible articles written in the 90s that say we could do it with supercomputers. You use kind of approximative techniques. And you can get a pretty good answer. And that would be one solution. But that doesn't tell you that's not doing anything. That's just one kind of calculation problem. All it gives you is some knowledge, right? But it still doesn't do anything. Another calculation problem would be to say, okay, we have, we want 10,000 more barrels of oil. How many more inputs do we need? And so if you say this is what people want in terms of final goods, how many of the kind of goods that we have to make those do we need to generate? And that's a different problem. You need to solve the first problem, but then you have to be able to kind of shift things around, right? So already then you get into problems of control. Even harder is to say, we don't just have this one matrix, we have all of these different matrices that show different techniques, right? Because if I make something with one machine, I may require, 3 barrels of oil, but if I make it with another machine, I may only require 2. So you don't just have one matrix, you have a lot of matrices, and you have to choose which one is best. And you have to not only choose which one is best, but you have to choose what you think best is. You have to choose what your idea of the optimum is. And that requires somebody to make a decision. What is it that they want the most of? Do we want more barrels of oil? Do we want more styrofoam packing peanuts? There are a lot of things that we do or don't want, right? Somebody has to pick an idea of the optimum. And we may come up with some idea of human welfare, some synthetic thing. But the point is somebody has to pick that. You can't get away from somebody making that choice. So what I'm kind of trying to say is that, we have these giant matrices, right? These kind of giant, rows of numbers that are 10 million long on one side and 10 million other. But really inside those matrices are bodies, right? Just like in the movie The Matrix, you see that kind of row, that rain of numbers falling down. But really what's behind that is this kind of matrix of human bodies sitting in these kind of vats and being, drained of their energy. There are always humans inside the matrix. And this is something that none of the discussions of the kind of socialist calculation problem really address. So the only way to sort of get around this is if we really think that people can just be kind of moved around instantly from one production site to another. And but the problem is that you may tell people to do something. You may set a target for productivity. You may issue commands to people, but people are sort of unpredictable and they're sort of incalculable. And it's really hard to calculate what happens when you start telling people what to do, right? Humans have this kind of capacity to hear things and interact with each other and communicate with each other in ways that have incalculable effects. And that was really the problem in the Soviet Union, right? You had no way of getting those orders and those commands to people in some way that they would actually follow. And the only way around this problem, and the only way to kind of make this system of central planning perfectible, and I think that we probably wouldn't want to perfect it, is if you kind of changed what it meant to be human, right? If you changed that kind of sense of unpredictability that happens when people communicate to each other, and you made people calculable in some way. That doesn't sound very desirable to me, but it does sound like a kind of a possible vision of a sort of future world. And that's really the only way that I think, central planning like this could function and could make human action calculable. Otherwise, we have to go some other route that's not central planning, that accepts the kind of incalculability of human action, that accepts kind of mediation and indeterminacy, and the fact that when people agree to do something, they don't always do it, that their ideas about things may change, that what I want to do today is not necessarily what I want to do tomorrow. And if you accept that kind of human incalculability, a lot of these kinds of utopian planning schemes really start to kind of fall out. So what I want to do is I want to talk about how in some way, I think what's implicit in these kinds of visions of central planning is this different idea of the human. And I just want to show you some scenes from, oh, yeah. I want to show you, now I need to go back to, gather windows. Oh, mirror displays, that's what I want to do. Okay, so this is Melanie Gilligan's film, The Common Sense, which actually hasn't been released. Colors are not right. And basically, this film portrays a kind of world in which there's this new technology that has come about, which allows people to feel each other's emotions directly. And this becomes a kind of tool of voyeurism and intercommunication, but it also becomes a kind of tool of social control. It's called The Patch. And here's a scene that's really based upon the kind of idea, the cybernetic idea of feedback. And it's a sort of portrait of the unpredictability that's inherent in these systems of control and this attempt to kind of root around the socialist calculation problem and problems of management. I'll just say one more thing and then I'll end. That the movie, the Common Sense at the end, and this is, I don't know if people recognize this building, the whole film is filmed here in the Netherlands and kind of, art and design type spaces. So I don't know if anybody recognizes this structure. You do? Okay, yes. So yeah, she filmed it here with money from some Dutch institution. So one of the things that's really interesting and perhaps a bit chilling about the movie is that there are people who reject the patch technology that's put into their brain and allows them to feel each other's feelings. Some people reject it. They don't accept it, just like you don't accept a new organ, right? But then in those patch rejection cases, what they start to notice is that they've developed a new organ. They've developed a new organ in their brain that allows them to actually do what the patch does naturally. right? And the movie kind of suggests that this is a way that the market has become kind of biological, that people start to coordinate their activity directly, and the market has kind of literalized itself in human bodies. In many ways, I think that's sort of what the dream of Google Gosplan is, and I would suggest that that's a sort of, you know, this kind of film shows how chilling that sort of vision is, and I think I'll just leave it there.